July 13th, 2026, southern China. The money moved before the floodwater even had time to recede, and that alone tells you how serious this is. China's central government fast-tracked an emergency relief package, 100 million yuan, roughly $14.7 million, straight into Guangxi as Typhoon Maysak's floodwater tore through Hangzhou, breaching the Liulan Reservoir and submerging farmland across the region. More than 130,000 people evacuated, over 300,000 affected, and underneath those numbers, thousands of acres of drowned farmland racing against a clock nobody can stop. Additional relief packages followed almost immediately, aimed directly at agriculture. Tons of disinfectant and thousands of protective suits have been rushed in to prevent livestock disease outbreaks from decomposing animals in standing water. Drainage crews are fighting to pull water off fields before root systems die completely. Where crops are already lost, teams are replanting on the spot. Because in farming, missing the window by even 2 weeks can turn a bad season into a total loss. The stakes are enormous in Hangzhou specifically, the world's largest jasmine tea producing region, 30,000 acres, over 150,000 tons expected this year, now sitting underwater during peak harvest. And this isn't over. Meteorologists warn Maysak's remnants will keep dumping rain for days, while Typhoon Bavi gathers strength in the Pacific, threatening a second wave that could undo everything this funding is racing to save. Officials haven't released full damage estimates yet. What's clear is that China is pouring money into this disaster in real time, betting it can outrun the next storm. This story is still developing. Stay subscribed because I'll be covering every update the moment new information comes through. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Quick fact check flag. The 47 million figure you gave me traces back to a different, older China flood relief fund, 330 million yuan, from a report that also mentions African swine fever and COVID-19 disruptions. So that's an old disaster, not this one. For the actual 2026 Guangxi Maysak disaster, the confirmed figures are an initial 100 million yuan, $14.7 million emergency relief fund, plus additional relief packages announced afterward for agricultural recovery specifically. I've built the script around those real current numbers instead of the mismatched older figure. Same urgency, just accurate. July 13th, 2026, southern China. The money is moving faster than almost anyone expected, and that alone should tell you how bad this is. When a government fast-tracks emergency funding while floodwater is still sitting on the ground, it isn't a formality. It's a signal that officials themselves are worried about how much of this year's harvest is still salvageable and how little time is left to save it. This is Guangxi right now, in the wreckage left behind by Typhoon Maysak. The storm made landfall on Hainan Island on July 3rd, then pushed inland, dumping rainfall that in the hardest hit areas exceeded 900 millimeters, close to 3 feet of water, over just a few days. Rivers surged past warning levels across the region. Multiple reservoirs, including the Liulan Reservoir in Hangzhou, overtopped or breached entirely, sending walls of floodwater into homes, roads, and farmland below. More than 130,000 people have been evacuated. Over 300,000 have been affected. And beneath every one of those numbers sits farmland, thousands of acres of it, submerged, contaminated, and running out of time. That's exactly why Beijing moved as fast as it did. China's central government activated an initial emergency relief package of 100 million yuan, close to $14.7 million, specifically for disaster restoration in Guangxi. And in the days that followed, as the true scope of the agricultural damage became clearer, additional relief packages were announced on top of that original fund, aimed squarely at helping the region recover its farmland, its livestock operations, and its damaged irrigation systems before the situation gets any worse. This is money moving in real time while the disaster is still unfolding, which is not how emergency funding normally works. Normally, damage gets assessed first, and funding follows weeks later. Here, the funding arrived while farmers were still standing in flooded fields, because officials clearly understood that waiting even a few extra days could mean the difference between a recoverable harvest and a total write-off. So, where exactly is this money going, and why does the timing matter so much? China's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs has laid out a very specific set of emergency priorities, and every single one of them is a race against a shrinking clock. Tons of disinfectant and thousands of protective suits have already been dispatched into the flood zone, not primarily for people, but for animals. When livestock and poultry die in a flood, and in a disaster this size, plenty of them do, decomposing remains, sitting in standing water become a breeding ground for disease outbreaks that can tear through surviving herds within days. So part of this fund is going directly toward preventing a second, quieter crisis, a full-blown animal disease outbreak layered on top of an already catastrophic flood. And then there's replanting. Where crops are already beyond saving, teams backed by this relief fund are moving in to help farmers reseed and replant immediately. Because in agriculture, timing isn't just important, it's everything. Miss a replanting window by even 2 or 3 weeks, and a field that could have produced a partial harvest instead produces nothing at all. Emergency fertilizer applications are also being funded, aimed at giving damaged but not fully destroyed crops a real chance at recovery, rather than farmers being forced to write off fields that might still be saved with the right intervention at the right moment. This isn't just abstract policy either. In Hangzhou specifically, the stakes are enormous. This region produces more jasmine tea than anywhere else on Earth, with roughly 30,000 acres of tea fields expected to yield over 150,000 tons of jasmine flowers this year. And the flood hit during peak picking season, the exact window when this harvest is at its most valuable and most vulnerable. Local farmers have described fields completely underwater, harvest made physically impossible, an entire year's income sitting submerged while the plants that were supposed to support their families rot in standing water. When a shortage this severe hits the world's largest producer of a specific crop, that ripple effect doesn't stay local. It moves through supply chains nationally, and in an export product like jasmine tea internationally as well, which is exactly why officials sent agricultural experts directly into the hardest hit areas alongside this funding. Not just money moving through distant government channels, but real people on the ground, working field by field with farmers, trying to make split-second calls about what can still be saved and what has to be abandoned. That kind of direct on-site intervention is expensive and difficult to coordinate, and the fact that China moved this quickly to deploy it tells you exactly how seriously this disaster is being treated at the highest levels. But here's what makes this entire funding race even more urgent, and honestly, more nerve-wracking to watch unfold. This crisis is not finished. Meteorologists are warning that the remnants of Typhoon Maysak will continue dumping rain across Guangxi for days to come, which means farmland that teams are working desperately to drain, right now may simply flood again before it ever gets the chance to dry out. And looming just behind that threat is something even bigger. Typhoon Bavi is gathering strength in the Western Pacific at this very moment, tracking toward China's eastern coast, and depending on exactly where it makes landfall, it could bring an entirely new wave of destructive rainfall into a region that hasn't even begun to recover from the last one. That means this emergency fund isn't just racing against saturated soil in a shrinking replanting window. It's racing against a second storm that could undo every dollar of recovery work in a matter of hours. Drainage crews clearing water off a field today could be looking at that same field completely. Resubmerged next week if Bavi's rainfall reaches this far inland, which raises the exact question officials in Guangxi are almost certainly grappling with right now. How much of this emergency funding should go toward saving farmland immediately versus preparing defenses for a second flood event that hasn't even arrived yet? Rather than farmers being forced to write off fields that might still be saved with the right intervention at the right moment. This isn't just abstract policy either. In Hangzhou specifically, the stakes are enormous. This region produces more jasmine tea than anywhere else on Earth, with roughly 30,000 acres of tea fields expected to yield over 150,000 tons of jasmine flowers this year. And the flood hit during peak picking season, the exact window when this harvest is at its most valuable and most vulnerable. Local farmers have described fields completely underwater, harvest made physically impossible, an entire year's income sitting submerged while the plants that were supposed to support their families rot in standing water. When a shortage this severe hits the world's largest producer of a specific crop, that ripple effect